Thanks for joining the Justice Project to listen to authentic voices, local voices, as they share how moral courage can transform the COVID virus response in Santa Clara County. We were the first county to be attacked by this virus, but we aren't going down without a fight. Join us, interact directly with our change makers who stand up for the rights of our most vulnerable population. I'm Reverend Ray, the executive director for PACT of Silicon Valley, which is People Acting in Community Together. We are a multi-faith, multicultural organization who develops and train leaders to speak truth to power. We push for policies that drive economic and racial and criminal justice for all. We stand for human rights for immigrants. We stand for affordable housing. We stand for police accountability. And we push mayors and sheriffs and top officials to get on board with transforming unjust systems so that everyone gets the same quality of life. Santa Clara has been swept into the eye of this storm in the wake of this pandemic. And PACT and over 100 local faith, clergy, and tribal leaders are standing witness to our most vulnerable population and the frontline workers who serve them. We have come together to protect our most vulnerable. At this time, I'd like to welcome our panel of amazing faith leaders and clergy community builders. I'd like to introduce first Rabbi Melanie Aron. And Rabbi Aron, tell us a little bit about yourself, your community of faith, what's giving you fuel during this time of this pandemic, and some of the work that you've done in Santa Clara County.
Sure. I'm the rabbi at Congregation Shir Hadash, which is a Reform synagogue that represents the more progressive movement in Judaism. Our members come from all over the valley, from Sunnyvale and Cupertino down to Almaden and South San Jose and everywhere in between. We're very proud that we have a decade of history with PACT. We've been involved in campaigns for the expansion of healthcare, transportation for the elderly, gun violence prevention. And recently we've turned our focus to hate, to racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism, which we find on the rise. What I find empowering during this period is the importance that people are giving to connections, that we are really appreciating how much we are connected one with each other and the importance of personal connections. And I hope we can build on that.
Thank you, Rabbi Aron. Next, I would like to introduce to you Reverend Steve Peakston.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Reverend Steve Pinkston. I'm an educator at Bellarmine College Preparatory in San Jose. I direct the Christian Service Program there. And I'm also an associate pastor at Maranatha Christian Center, an interdenominational church in San Jose. You ask what fuels my work. I think of the Hebrew scripture in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. That fuels me pre-COVID-19, during COVID-19, and long beyond COVID-19 passes us. Maranatha, I'm happy to say, well, before I talk about Maranatha, I've been involved with jail and prison ministry for the last 30 years. 30 years at San Quentin State Prison, 25 years at County Jail, Elmwood County Jail, as well as Juvenile Hall. Our church is very involved with the reentry program. It's one of 4 reentry programs in San Jose for men, women who are released from prison, men, women who are released from county jail. We help to provide them with housing options, with transitional housing units, and share them options for single living environments. We have a food pantry, we have a clothing closet for them. We provide resources relative to drug and alcohol recovery. We receive them and let them know that they are created in the eyes of God and have value. And we try to encourage them to reestablish themselves in society and make a difference now that they're out, now that they're forgiven, now that they've paid their debt.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. Now I'd like to introduce to you Reverend Joseph Lee.
Hi, my name is Joey, and I serve as the executive presbyter for the Presbytery of San Jose. Our denomination is the Presbyterian Church USA. I represent those congregations. Our northern border is in Palo Alto. Our southern border is in Gonzales, just a little bit south of Salinas. I've been serving as the executive and been on staff with the Presbytery for the last 24 years. I would say right now, I think what fuels me is first the observation that the pandemic has really exposed our society. It has exposed deep fault lines in healthcare, in culture and race. It's exposed economics. And so, you know, it's been said that never let a good crisis go to waste. And I guess part of my thinking, and hopefully among leaders in our congregations, is this major disruption is indeed a crisis. And the question becomes whether we're going to let it go to waste or not, whether we're going to learn from it, and whether we're going to grow from it. So right now, that's pretty much on my mind all the time. It's good to be with you.
Excellent, and you're definitely welcome. And last but not least, we have Reverend Terence Gleason.
Hi, Ray, thank you. So my name is Terry Gleason. I'm rector of All Saints in Palo Alto. Our parish, as some of you may know, hosts the food closet on our campus. We've participated historically in creating the Opportunity Center in Palo Alto, as well as participating in Hotel de Zinc. So we have a long history of ministry towards a homeless and hungry population. More recently, that's been focused on immigrants and refugees. We have an action group around that participates in advocacy, in actually paying people's bail money, bond money, as well as helping them settle, and multifaceted engagement with the immigrant refugee population. I think that personally, the thing that kind of fuels me, the thing that always has inspired me is that parable of the Gerasene. Not the parable; it's a real story. Gerasene demoniac, of this man who Jesus encounters on the very edge of town, who's been excluded, who's living in caves, who's gashing himself with stones, who's possessed and uncontrollable, and just a victim at so many levels. And at the end of this encounter, he is seated and clothed and in his right mind and engaged in conversation. And it kind of, I feel that's where our ministry, my ministry, wants to go, to scour the edges and bring into conversation, to have people sit and talk in their right mind in a safe place. So as you can tell, I've lived in this country for a long time, I think 30 years, as you can tell by my impeccable American accent, but I'm actually from Sydney, Australia. I've served here for 10 years, before that in Vermont, and before that in New York City.
Wonderful. We welcome you all. You're amazing, and we're just excited to have you with us. So before we get into our questions, I'd like to just offer up a word of prayer for my panel and for those who have joined us live on Facebook. And we're grateful to have you, and I hope you're excited about our presentation today. Will you join me in prayer? In the name of love, in the name of solidarity, we come in faith, faith known by many names. May that faith known by many names drive us to have compassion and love for one another. May we know the blessings that there is equality, there is justice, there is peace available for all if we can work together in unity. Let us lift up those who are marginalized and socially impacted during this corona crisis. Let us come together as one in unity and in solidarity. And in doing so, we will really know and live out our true faith, which are called by many names. So I give thanks for this moment and this sacred space. Ashe, Amen, and Shalom. All right, let's get right to it. The first question that I have, and I'm glad that we're all here to chat, is we're going to go deep right out the gate. Can you share insight into how equity has been elevated or how equity has been eroded during this COVID-19 crisis? And I want to start with Rabbi Melanie.
Right. Well, I'm going to echo some of the things that Joey opened with. I think it's very clear to all of us that some in our valley have been impacted much more painfully by the virus, both in terms of illness and death, and also the economic fallout. It's one thing to shelter in place when you have a comfortable home, when you have equipment so you can be on Zoom as we are today and be comfortable. It's another thing if you're living in a place that is too crowded, lacks the hardware, lacks the connectivity, or is unsafe. There are women who are afraid at home, who've been victims of domestic violence. There are people making the decision to go out to work, not because it's safe for them, but because they feel they need to do that to put bread on the table. So I think it is true that this virus has made inequities that have existed for a long time much more visible. And the health outcomes for people of color indicate how little there has been done to make equity in healthcare and other issues of structural racism. In particular, for me, I'm concerned that in times of fear and economic dislocation, people look for a scapegoat for the pain that they're feeling. And this is a process that is difficult to overcome. And it's twice as difficult if the leadership at the top is not helping in that regard. Calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus has resulted in violence against Asian Americans. And the use of anti-Semitic tropes accusing Jews of somehow benefiting from the epidemic are circulating in a way that they haven't since the Middle Ages. We have not acknowledged the Nazi tropes in the recent protests against shelter in place, and that just encourages that form of expression that is injurious to Jews, to African Americans, to other minorities, and also injurious to our democracy. We feel very fortunate our congregation has been spared a direct hit, but other synagogues right here in the Bay Area have been hit by anti-Semitic and pornographic attacks during worship and during study. So for a community that was already anxious, this has been very unsettling in terms of having a very tenuous sense of safety.
Very impactful, and thank you so much, Rabbi Aron, for sharing those insights. Also, those who are viewing with us on Facebook Live, feel free as you're listening to our panelists to put your questions in the chat box, and our panelists will have the opportunity at the end to answer some of your questions. Reverend Joey, go ahead and let us know your thoughts on this first question.
Well, certainly as an Asian American, it was incredibly disheartening, although quite frankly, not surprising to see the rise of anti-Asian violence, particularly when leaders at the top don't add to the, exacerbate the situation. I've heard of stories in our congregations, individuals who have been verbally harassed at supermarkets or on the streets, haven't encountered any acts of violence per se, but there is something about the microaggressions of people letting you know that you're not welcome and not wanted. These are not, and it ranges from people who are recent immigrants to those who have been here for generations. And the constant and continuing feeling in much of the Asian American community is that if you've been here for 4 and 5 generations, and yet all it takes is one little thing, and suddenly you're identified, singled out, and told you are still not American enough, that's incredibly painful. I have colleagues across the country, Asian American pastors, one in New Jersey who was already sheltering in place, but felt like, given what's been going on in New Jersey, he said, it's just one more reason why I don't want to go outside. I have another colleague who's a pastor in Brooklyn. And when he does go out, he is very aware and conscious of who is around him, who might be approaching him. And it's that, additional fear already on top of a very anxious and fearful time. And again, it is exposing it. It doesn't mean that it just came up. It's always been there, but there seems to be permission given that somehow it is okay to behave and say and do things, and breaks my heart.
Thank you so much, Reverend Joy, for sharing. Reverend Terence, let us know your thoughts.
Echo Joey. I'm half of a biracial marriage, and we have an adopted biracial child. So I have a half Asian marriage and a half African American child. And what I think, exactly what Joey said, I think this is simply revealed deep strands that have been always present there. My experience through my family particularly is that racism is every bit as virulent here as in other parts of the country. It's just subtle and it's disguised, but it's so pervasive, and that its victims have become accustomed, as everywhere, to simply accepting this. I frequently had the experience with my own husband that we're in a restaurant or something. I said, did that actually happen? Is that what I think it was? Because it's so hidden. It's so unremarkable, I guess, that people, the victim. My father-in-law has been here for over 50 years. He says that he has experienced racism every single day that he's been here, which is an exaggeration on one hand, and it's no less true for that. So I in my own congregation, I know that I have people who are lying low, somewhat lower than shelter in place would demand, but who know from a lifetime's experience that the racism that they have encountered on a regular basis will only be exacerbated.
Excellent. Thank you, Reverend Terry. Reverend Steve.
I think Rabbi Melanie spoke about cited racial disparities. I'd like to, delve into that just a wee bit. Disparities in infection rates as well as death rates. And I can go to the East Coast. I can look at a place like New York, where 9% of the population is African American, yet 17% of the deaths in New York happen to be within the African American community, almost double the rate of the population. Here in Silicon Valley, Santa Clara County, the African American population makes up about 2% of the population. But that's triple when you look at the death rates of African Americans here. Why is that? Is it due to pre-existing conditions? Well, that may be a piece of it. I certainly have high blood pressure. I exercise every day. I try to watch my diet. I try to do the right things. But racism is ever present with me. And that stress causes that blood pressure to rise. I look at the Latino population here in Silicon Valley, making up 27% of the population, yet 38% of the infection rates of folks with COVID-19. that disparity is way out of alignment. It challenges me. It should challenge all of us. And I spoke about the blood pressure that I have. When I look back on the East Coast again in New York, as of a week ago, over 85% of the arrests that were made for people who were not abiding by the social distancing rules, over 85% of the people that were arrested were African Americans. That's ludicrous. You know, I look at pictures in Los Angeles and Coney Island, all over the country, with people going to the beach and not abiding by the social distancing rules. And I don't see too many people that look like me, have my melanin, but yet and still I go to a place like Brooklyn, and that's where the overwhelming majority of people arrested, you know, look like me. So disparities, inherent racism, institutional racism challenges me. It should challenge all of us. As Reverend Joey talked about being troubled, I'm appalled that somebody would look at an Asian person. I saw the news report the other day when someone asked the president about why we have to brag about the number of testing that's happening in this United States. And he threw the question back at an Asian reporter and saying, well, why don't you ask that unfair question that to China? I'm like, where does something like that come from? It's reprehensible.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. In light of all of the pre-existing racial tension that has come about with our current national administration, COVID has only just pulled back the covers all the way to our toes, where we're really dealing with the crux of what has already existed. Let's continue on. Let's lean in a little further. This next question is for Reverend Terence and Reverend Joy. Reverend Steve and Rabbi Melanie, you guys will follow on the next question. But for Reverend Terence and Joy, how will you work to build power for one of the equity and justice issues stated in our moral response letter? So how will you build and seek to build power? Your leadership, what's fueling you, what's giving you gas? How will you use that to build power?
So even before the pandemic struck, one of the things that our presbytery did was we declared ourselves to be a sanctuary presbytery. We have congregations involved in sanctuary for undocumented, whether it's accompanying them to court appearances or after, let's say, one of the parents has been deported, accompanying the family and trying to offer support. And while individual congregations were doing that, the presbytery decided that we needed to take a more corporate position, and we became the first presbytery in our denomination to declare itself a sanctuary presbytery. And beyond that, we are trying to get our entire denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, to declare itself a sanctuary denomination, such that we would give shelter or aid for those whom God has called the least of these, that we have been reminded that we should welcome the stranger in our midst. And so much of American history has been one of welcome, and yet it seems most recently that welcome mat has been pulled away. And so it is that one of the things that we've already done, and this has interrupted our work, which is to be a more corporate voice of welcome for immigrants, and in particular the undocumented.
Thanks, Joey. I would just talk about something that is that I have energy about at the moment, I guess. I haven't got the solution, but one of the things that has really struck me about this experience And that the first casualties in many of our Silicon Valley corporations were diversity and inclusion and corporate social responsibility. As soon as money looked to be scarce, the first victims in corporate America, in this part of the world anyway, were those people who functioned to keep communities together, to encourage employees to harness energy and direct that towards good works. Our firms have stated that they are committed to the care of their employees, to giving back to their communities. They've said repeatedly that this is not about marketing. This arises out of a deep conviction, but the first people thrown overboard when the dollars began to dry up were the very people who actually make a difference in communities and who actually contribute towards the diversity of our population. So these are the people who I regard as the clergy of the corporate world, the people who are actually creating communities, who are nurturing relationships and connections. So I am enraged personally that there is this massive lie that has been exposed because it was never about people. It was never about connection. It wasn't about giving back or caring or being responsible. It really was just about marketing. And as soon as that didn't pay, then we throw those people overboard. Employees across the board have been betrayed, and we've been betrayed. We read the good stories in the newspaper about responsible companies and owners who are really doing a lot for their employees, but there are a whole lot of other people who have been just thrown overboard. There's been this massive hidden damage and anger in our community, and I'd like to see some public accounting of how these companies, of how they've abandoned their employees and revealed their own duplicity.
Excellent. Great engagement, great insight, and definitely lots of room for action for us as communities of faith to join in solidarity and to confront some of these issues that are most pressing during this time. All right, let's lean in a little further. The next two questions are, the next question, is for Rabbi Melanie and for Reverend Steve. In California, we have 71,000 infected statewide. In national, some of the highest infection rates are in the prison and in detention centers. Share your stories about the prison system if you'd like to give us insight.
But I'd like to talk about three things. I'd like to talk about our state reform movement. I'd like to talk about a colleague of mine, and then I'd like to talk about an experience we had in the congregation. The reform movement of Judaism in California, RAC California, has made reducing the population in jails and prisons and protecting incarcerated people and staff members our highest priority. This is because of our commitment to a value, pikuach nefesh, the saving of a life, which overrides other commitments, and tzedek tzedek tirdof, justice, justice must you pursue. It's not enough with justice to do what falls in hand. You really have to go out into the world and do the work of justice. I don't know how many of you saw an op-ed in this morning's New York Times written by a friend of mine, a colleague, a reform woman rabbi from Southern California. Heather had been involved in prison, and because of that, a building at Rikers Island, one of the largest prisons in New York, was named for her grandmother. And she talked about her great shame, how her grandmother would not be proud given what's going on there. 70% of those incarcerated there are awaiting trial. Yes. They face a potential death sentence and they haven't even been convicted of a crime. So she writes about what's going on. Criminal justice affects us all, no matter where our congregations are, whether in the city or in the suburbs. We have young people who end up in jail for drug issues. And recently we had a particular congregant who had mental health issues, and as often is the case, found himself in the jail system. And it was heartbreaking. First of all, he didn't belong there. Second of all, we couldn't move him over. There is a mental health court, but the other court wouldn't let go of him. His father was very ill, terminally ill. We couldn't get permission for a visit. His father died. We couldn't get permission for him to attend the funeral. And then to add insult to injury, shortly thereafter, they did decide to discharge him. In the middle of the night, they just dropped him off at a random place, no money, no housing, no plan for his discharge. This isn't safe for him, and it's also not safe for the community. There are asymptomatic carriers. So it's very important for us to see that people who are not a danger to society get released from prison so they are not in danger, and that when people are released, that there be some kind of plan for them, that they're not just dropped off in the middle of nowhere. So these are some of the issues on my mind.
I will say amen to everything you've said, Rabbi Melanie. You understand why people are released from prison in the middle of the night. If I am due to be released on, let's pick a date, June 15th, well, right after midnight on June 14th, they'll release me. So they don't have to, the prison system does not have to expend any money to release me in the middle of the day or at noontime. It's crazy. I shared earlier in introducing myself that I've been volunteering at San Quentin State Prison for the last 30 years. And I've been in Donner Block. I've been in West Block. In a particular block, you have approximately 1,000 men, 200 on each of the 5 tiers going up. 50 cells on one side of a tier, 50 cells on another side of a tier. 2 persons per cell. Well, 2 times 50 on this side is 100, 2 times 50 on the other side is 100. So 200 guys per tier. Social distancing, that's a joke. Trying to say that 2 men in a, tiny, 6x8 cell can be 6 feet apart. It's a joke. One would have to sleep on a top bunk and the other would have to sleep on the floor with their heads at opposite ends of the cell for that to possibly be achieved. I typically would have gone into San Quentin in February, but it's locked down now. I can't go in. So all of the educational programs, all of the vocational programs that exist for prisoners are shut down. And I understand it. You don't want someone coming in with COVID-19 who may be asymptomatic, but still have the disease to so quickly spread. Because if it gets into the prison system, it's like a petri dish. I was a scientist as an undergrad major, biologist, and it's just going to feed and spread and spread. It's going to be like a wildfire. And that's the way it is in certain prisons, once it gets in. So I concur with you, Rabbi Melanie, that folks who are, older than me, 65, who are in prison, who have spent, 20, 30 years, who have been rehabilitated, folks who are waiting trial for a nonviolent crime, folks who are incarcerated for doing things that people are making money on today, selling marijuana. It's ludicrous. It does not make sense. So many people could be released and not be susceptible to the coronavirus that is not discriminating. Say, well, I'll go to this cell, I won't go to that cell. It's just going to hit as many people as possible.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing, Rabbi Melanie and Reverend Steve. Now listen, I'm 5 minutes over the time that I asked you, and I apologize. So I have an ask. Will you allow me 15 additional minutes so that we can lean in a little further with these questions?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. This next question, Steve, Reverend Steve and Reverend Joey, you're up again. This statement, Organizers like Faith in the Valley are protesting the filling of detention centers and seek decarceration. Organizers want immigrant judges to cease virtual hearings and deportations during this crisis. So what are your thoughts? Reverend Joy, you can go first.
For Presbytery, we had a committee set up a meeting with someone from ICE to an attempt to begin dialogue. And what we have seen, this is several months back, what we have seen, of course, is the continued anti-immigration tendencies of this administration. And again, the pandemic has only emboldened so that not only are borders shut and immigration ceased, and so much of our work with refugees has been curtailed because of first initially the declining number of folks admitted, and then ultimately all immigration is prevented at this time. So the detention centers and the way that immigration judges are I was able to attend an immigration hearing in Arizona where each person was there and was given less than 5 minutes with an attorney, and immediately to call it justice is laughable. To hear their stories, there was none. It was simply folks were rounded up. They were given some minimum time before a judge, and they were immediately taken to jail and then soon deported. So I'm at a loss. I think the faith community has been advocating, has been trying to stand up, but it seems to fall on deaf ears. So I'm not particularly hopeful about this situation right now.
When I spoke earlier and talked about what fuels me, and I mentioned Micah 6, verse 8, what does the Lord require of you? To love justice, to pursue justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. I think sometimes we in the faith community are out of step with others, some others in America, in the fact that we want mercy, we appreciate grace, unmerited favor. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus talks about welcoming the stranger. Welcoming the stranger. Not dissing the stranger, not deporting the stranger, not hating the stranger, not vilifying the stranger, but welcoming the stranger. Welcoming those who are at your door, who are desperate, who are fleeing danger, who are fleeing drug cartels that are trying to twist and challenge them in their native lands. They're coming here not because they're saying, hey, I can get a free lunch, but that I can work hard, that I can hopefully get a job where I can support my family. And I am compelled, I am called to welcome and not to dismiss and disassociate from. So, Reverend Joey spoke about being in an Arizona courtroom. I've been there too, and listened to defense attorneys who have 2 minutes, 3 minutes to meet a defendant and try to plead a case, and there's no justice there. There's no justice. So I the golden rule is what I embrace again. Do to others as I would want others to do to me. If I'm a Haitian refugee, I've been to Haiti multiple times and I've seen desperation there. If I'm a Haitian refugee and I'm coming to a place like America so that I don't have to eat mud cookies. Yeah, you heard me right. Cookies made of dirt and a little bit of water, a little bit of baking powder, such that I can have something on my stomach. I'm fleeing that so I can have a life here. And you tell me, no, he or she is illegal. They're an alien. Get out of here. I don't want to hear the story. I plead for mercy. I plead for grace.
Thank you so much for those compassionate insight. All right, we're gonna lean into our last question, and this is for all of you before we take a few questions from our live audience on Facebook. So the question for all of my panel: in California, we're starting to reopen to a new normal. What is the number one issue that you want transformed in this moment? What is the number one issue you want transformed in this moment? And jump in.
I'm going to jump in.
Good.
A transformation of moving from the me, the my, the I to the we. Father Greg Boyle, Jesuit priest with Homeboy Industries down in Southern California, talks about the movement toward kinship, brotherhood, sisterhood, the we, where I'm looking out for my neighbor's looking out for me. It's not so much me being selfish and so self-absorbed looking at me and mine. But you know, I have a neighbor across the street. This is straying a little bit from the subject. I had a neighbor across the street, Janice, and recently I during COVID-19, she has to go to work up in Mountain View. I saw that her garage door was up in the middle of the morning. It's like 10:30 in the morning. I'm like, her car's not there, and so I call her. She left her phone at home, so I call her son in Minnesota. And say, hey, do you have another work number for your mom? Because her garage is up and I think she's vulnerable. And so he calls her and she came home and she thanked me profusely. But that's the concern for my neighbor. Can I be a good neighbor? I'm going to pass the baton because I've chewed up a lot of that 5 minutes.
I would just add quickly, when we talked about equity issues earlier, the piece I wanted to add was that one group of people who have increased equity perhaps are, however briefly, are our people working in our supermarkets and FedEx and UPS and our mail deliverers and all these people who actually make our lives work are our heroes for this. I had to go to the dentist this afternoon, and the dental assistant came in who hasn't worked for a month, but this was her first day back at work because I had a dental emergency. So you know, there's this sort of, I have this privilege of being able to contact a dentist and have someone come in, but I couldn't do that without this person who's otherwise dependent on a handout check. So there has been this shift, I think, in what we are valuing in one another. And so what I would like to see is more of that perhaps someone along the line will question why we are spending $700 billion on military and not on our people. Why is our infrastructure so crumbling when we have and poor? Why are we having crisis in healthcare and in supplies and because we haven't valued people, we haven't valued connection and relationship. So that's what I would like to see, some massive shift in what we actually hold to be important at a deep level in this community.
So I responded, Reverend Ray, to your question about reopening, first of all, with concern that we really use hard data in thinking about reopening and not wishful thinking and not a response to threats for violence or political pressure. So that's the first response I have. And then I heard Reverend Terry talk about privilege, and it reminded me of an experience I had in Israel going with a group of women of a certain age, as they say politely, my age, to stand at the mahsom, to stand at the border, to make sure that those young soldiers doing their required service, 18, 19-year-old teenagers, behave the way they'll behave if they know their mother is watching. And I think we all need to do that. We need to somehow convey to society that we are watching. We are watching what happens at Elmwood. We are watching what happens to the undocumented. We are watching to see what happens to healthcare for people of color in our community. So that's a second thing. And then the third thing is we need to be very watchful that we're not allowed to be pulled apart, because we have been strong when we've been able to work together. And there are many forces that are trying to get people to engage in a sort of victim Olympics. But it doesn't really matter. We're all vulnerable and we're all victimized, and we need to work together.
Reverend Ray, you asked, what's the one thing I want to see transformed? And so I'm going to say two things.
Of course.
The first is we need universal health care. It is apparent when healthcare is tied to employment and you get fired, laid off, or furloughed, there goes your healthcare. Why is healthcare tied to employment? It should be universal. I'd like to see that transform. Not very optimistic, but nonetheless. The second thing is something I actually was listening to someone who works in corporate real estate. One of the things they're noticing is that with so many people working from home, that there are corporations that are realizing, one, they haven't had a drop in productivity. And so they're wondering, what are they doing with all this real estate? And then if in fact, whether we all go back to malls or not, I don't know, but there is some doubt as to whether that will happen. And if there is all this corporate or large real estate holdings, and they're not going to be going back to them, they should be converted to affordable housing, in my opinion.
Right.
So, I just think that's something that we should be thinking about, that society should be thinking about, even for our faith communities. I'm just beginning to have that conversation with, hoping to have this conversation with some of our pastors and leaders, that if in fact our congregations, we're sitting on a lot of land, we're not using all that land, shouldn't we be thinking about, especially in our area where housing is so expensive, affordable housing is something that we should be working on.
Amen.
Amen. Well, that transitions us, because next week our topic centers around housing and homelessness. But before I let you go, we have time for one question. This question comes from Penny Phillips on Facebook. And she asked the question, how can we get back to hope? Each of you, share your faith reflection to Penny's question.
I'll kick it off. I just was talking to one of my parishioners this morning who keep a gratitude journal, which she fills in every day. I think that for me personally, I am so incredibly grateful for where I live, for my family who is healthy, for being able to walk, ride our bikes and spend all this time together. I'm grateful for the support of my congregation, for so much encouragement and just nourishment at a deep level. I'm so grateful for the people who are helping at our supermarket, because I love our people at our supermarket. So there are just countless numbers of reasons to be hopeful, because we are surrounded by such goodness and such generosity and kindness. So that's my source.
Go ahead, Melanie.
I find hope in the Bible, because nobody had an easy life. Nobody's path was without difficulties. the Israelites didn't pop out of Egypt and end up at the promised land. They went through all kinds of suffering and difficulties and setbacks. And so I guess I'm looking forward to this also being a chapter in our life. Hopefully not the final chapter, but a chapter that we think of and remember, and that gives me hope because people have gotten through tough times before.
Recently, I led a group of students on an immersion trip to Tanzania in East Africa. The village that we spent time in, teaching English and installing solar panels with, didn't have electricity, didn't have running water, didn't have so many of the luxuries that we have. Tanzania has been hit with COVID-19, yet there was a spirit of community, a spirit of love, a spirit of hope, a spirit of we're in this together, we're on this ship together. And, looking at that, when I have so much material possessions and wealth, and I look at some people who have so little, I say, how can I not have hope? I must embrace hope.
This has been a tremendous disruption for many of us. But I reminded our faith community that if you want to know about disruption in someone's life, talk to a refugee, talk to an asylum seeker, talk to somebody who's lived through a war. That's real disruption, and they have survived, and we will also. I don't have a choice but to be hopeful, because I can't watch first responders, doctors and nurses who have worn protective equipment so long that it's left bruises and scars around their face, and they go in every day and save lives. And for me to give up, to not be hopeful, I can't face them if I'm not hopeful. It's not a hope that is based on wishful thinking. It's my hope is an audacious kind of sometimes angry hope that we will get through this and we will come out better at the other end.
Wonderful. And Penelope, my response as being a part of clergy is that I have hope, because as you look at Reverend Steve and Rabbi Melanie, Aron, and Reverend Joey and Reverend Terry, you have servant leaders who have engaged a lifetime of serving a community. And we have more clergy coming, where we're going to be able to lift up their voices. And the objective of having these amazing clergy and faith leaders with us is that we can hear the stories from their communities, from their perspectives. We could begin the investigation of finding out what are all of the moving pieces. Then we can move into action together. So that gives me hope, because as I believe Reverend Steve said, we're in this together. I have you and you have me. And together in solidarity, we will win this fight. So Penelope, that gives me hope even in the midst of adversity. So Reverend Steve, Rabbi Melanie, Reverend Joy, Reverend Terry, I am so grateful that you were a part of our first Justice Project segment. And I'm so happy to be able to lift up this platform so that people in our community, Santa Clara County and the various cities, could hear and see what amazing leadership looks like and what it means to come together as a community. So join us, and together we can create a different California and a stronger and more united, new and improved Silicon Valley. Next week, we're going to be coming to you with more clergy, more faith leaders and tribal elders as we discuss the strategies around housing and homelessness. But before I go, I want to say to Rabbi Melanie, happy 40th anniversary in retirement. You have served this community faithfully, and we are grateful to have you. You are iconic and a jewel for Silicon Valley and all of the cities here, not just your community of faith, but for all of us. And to Reverend Joy, we want to say happy Asian Pacific American Month. We celebrate the diversity and unity that we all bring to the table. So in closing, I would like to say peace, shalom, ashe, and thank you so much for your time in sharing with us. And we'll see you next week, same time, same place, new panels, new guests as we continue the Justice Project. Thank you so much, guys.
Amen. Blessings.